that's on here, practical lessons, starting with chapter 4 and going through chapter 5 and verse 22. We went through the first 8 verses of chapter 4, warnings against impurity, and that was in particular warnings against fornication, to abstain from that, and because we're called to holiness and purity, so warnings against that. Now then, we've gotten to verse 9 of exhortations to brotherly love and honest industry. So let's read these verses together, and then we'll come back to verse 9 and start talking about them. But as touching brotherly love, ye need not that I write unto you, for ye yourselves are taught of God to love one another. And indeed ye do it toward all the brethren which are in all Macedonia. But we beseech you, brethren, that ye increase more and more, and that ye study to be quiet, and to do your own business, and to work with your own hands, as we commanded you, that ye may walk honestly without, or toward them that are without, and that ye may have lack of nothing. So the start of this, dealing with brotherly love in particular. And Paul says, had no need to write unto you about that subject, the subject of brotherly love, because they had already been taught to love one another. Word brotherly love is the Greek word Philadelphia, and you can guess what city in the United States is named after that. You got it, Philadelphia. It's a city of, supposedly supposed to be the city of brotherly love. I won't make any comments about it, but the city, but A.T. Robertson in his commentary pointed out that in profane Greek, now let me stop there and say the word profane means common. We use profane speech generally in relationship to swearing, to impure language. It comes from that idea of being common. You had that which was common, and you had that which was holy, or that which was dedicated to God. And thus the profane, the common, was something as opposed to the temple or that which is of God. So that's the idea that common came from. Now then, when he's talking about profane Greek, he's talking about the common language of the people. And thus, if you go back the period that the New Testament was written in, it was a Roman period of Greek, but there are subdivisions, and the subdivision of New Testament Greek would be Koine Greek. And we thus call it Koine, or common Greek, because it was the Greek spoken of by the common man. That's what he's talking about when he says in profane Greek. It is just that Greek that was spoken by the common person. He says in profane Greek, one papyrus example and Septuagint, the word means love of those actually kin by blood. But in the New Testament, it is the kinship in the love of Christ as here. So if you think about brotherly love would deal with, in the common language of the people, as it was used, a physical relationship, a physical brother, and a love toward that physical brother. In the New Testament, it takes from that idea, but not actually, there's not an actual kinship by blood, there's a kinship by Christianity. And thus in the New Testament, this word is found 6 times, always denoting love, which unites Christians together. That's the aspect of it. It is a love that binds Christians together. I'm not going to read all of these verses, but Romans 12 and verse 10, if you want to write these down and read them later on. 1 Thessalonians 4 and verse 9. Hebrews 13 and verse 1. 1 Peter 1:22 and 2 Peter 1:7 is used twice. So if you want those again, Romans 12:10, 1 Thessalonians 4 and verse 9, Hebrews 13 and verse 1, 1 Peter 1, verse 22, and then 2 Peter 1 and verse 7, it's used 2 times there. Now, when you think of the first century, you have a situation where you have many Christians who have had to forsake family. Whether family was, if they were Jewish, the Jews persecuted Christians unmercifully. If it was the Gentiles, then they were basically paganistic in their views and thus rejected Christianity. So if one became a Christian from either group, they were ostracized. They lost family. But when one is born again, he is born into the family of God. And now then, that family, he has that family relations, along with all of those others who have been born into that family of God. Same thing that we see today. We are born into the family of God. We sing the song sometimes, God's Family. And every time we sing that, it still sticks in my craw. It's a good song. But the first time that I heard of it and heard it sung, had a Church of Christ preacher singing in a denominational congregation as he spoke there and singing with them that song. And then he proceeded to basically embrace them, that they are all just hospitals. We're all a hospital for people who have sick souls, and just come to this denominational group. But that was the very first time that I heard that song. So it just kind of, I think of that every time we sing it. It is a good song. Don't mean anything by it, and I'm not saying we shouldn't sing it. We should, because it is a good song. It expresses wonderful thoughts. But it's not in relationship to the denominational world. They're not our brethren. They've never been born into the family of God. We do have a family, though. It is God's family, those who have been born again, and that new birth process of John 3, verses 1 through 8, is seen when we obey the gospel, we obey the truth, by being baptized into Christ. And in that being baptized into Christ, Galatians 3:26 and 27, we then become a child of God. We're part of this family now of God. Those in the denominational world, though, have never done those things to become a child of God. They're not Christians, very simply. But instead of that former family that they once held and once had, and those relationships, now that you got these relationships as Christians. It's sad that many Christians never reach that point where God's family is the most important family. It's a process that we have to learn and we have to develop within our lives. But the truth is, God's family is the most important family, not physical relations. We want those in our physical family to obey the gospel and become a part of God's family as well. But God's family, it's those individuals, faithful individuals, who we're going to spend eternity with. Not necessarily our physical family, but those of the spiritual family. So this no doubt was an important aspect of the teaching that Paul was giving at that time. But this lust, or this brotherly love that he's talking about now, what a contrast to the first 8 verses. First 8 verses, fornication, lust, ungodliness, immorality, and we're not to be a part of that. Now then, what we have, touching brotherly love. Brother Robert Taylor wrote, such constituted lust and lascivious action. This beautiful word of Philadelphia encourages pure, wholesome love in attractive action. The former is selfish. The latter aims for selflessness in human relationships. The former is exploitive. The latter is edifying in nature. Fornication is not a fruit of brotherly love or any type of agape love. It is of the eros family, from which we derive erotic and other such words. So that's the contrast that Paul is making from this impurity to purity, to God's family. But there's a question I want you to ponder for a second. Paul says, as touching brotherly love, ye need not that I write unto you. And then he writes about it. Why does he write about it if he doesn't need to write about it? Okay, stirring up their memory, reminding them. It's always important. Remind people. Though, as Peter puts it, though you know it, going to put you in remembrance of it. Wait a minute, if you know it, why do you need to put them in remembrance? Because people forget.
It was a nice way to phrase it.
It was a nice way to phrase it. That's true. I told Tim this story about my dad years ago, as he would be holding meetings and he would be preaching, and he would have people come up to him on occasion saying, you know, we've heard that every single time and again, and they didn't do it just to him, they did it to a lot of preachers. As a result, preachers stopped preaching on those things. Guess what happened? That's exactly right. Started practicing them. Want evidence of that? How many sermons have you heard in the pulpit here about the sin of instrumental music and that we are to sing? We continue to hear it, don't we? There's a lot of places that didn't happen. They quit preaching on those subjects. Why? We've heard that 1,000 times. We know it, we don't. And guess what? Now then we've got congregations that are embracing instrumental music. Same way with Acts 2:38. So there's the need for that repetition. And repetition. That even though I don't need to, I'm going to write about it. Ellingworth and Nida, talking about this, wrote, "It may seem strange to say there is no need to write you about love for your fellow believers, and then do just that. This was a common device in ancient times and is characteristic of the way in which, at times, Paul implies the right kind of behavior in those to whom he writes, even while urging them on to greater and better behavior." Notice the latter part of verse 10. Still talking about this brotherly love that he had no need to write unto them, but he writes unto them about it anyway. Why? That ye increase more and more. They had brotherly love, but he says you need to develop even greater, even more of that brotherly love. You need to grow in brotherly love. And that's the way in which Paul, yes, compliments them in telling them you have brotherly love, you were taught it, but you need to continue in it, and you need to increase in it. The word taught of, or phrase taught of God, is from one Greek word. And this is its only occurrence, only time that this Greek word is used. How are we taught of God, though? Let me ask first, how were the Thessalonians taught of God? Through Paul's preaching. We might add through Paul's writings now as well. That's how they were taught of God. How are we taught of God? By doing the same thing, by instruction. We're also taught, though, by example. Paul's example. He calls upon himself as an example to them several times in this book that we've noted. In relationship to brotherly love, taught of God by his example. John 3:16, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish but have everlasting life." Doesn't that teach us brotherly love by the example that he set forth? Or 1 John 4 and verse 9. "In this was manifested the love of God toward us, because that God sent his only begotten Son into the world that we might live through him." And so again, here's an example that God gives of this that Paul's talking about. And so we look at the example of God and we learn how to be loving toward our brethren. But also, obviously, by instruction, by the teaching. John, the 13th chapter, verse 34 and verse 35. "A new commandment I give unto you, that ye love one another as I have loved you, that ye also love one another. By this shall all men know that you're my disciples if you have love one toward another. You have love one toward another, but then what does he say? He uses an illustration, as I have loved you. There's the type of love, but he's teaching them by instruction, by word, to love one another, and the importance of that love of one another. Being taught of God shows that the teaching is of divine origin. The teaching comes from God. Now, we ask, how did the Thessalonians learn it? Through Paul, his example and his teaching, his letter. But wait, it's of divine origin. Right? Well, obviously, yes. Why? Because Paul was speaking by inspiration of God. The words that he was teaching were of God and came from God. God selected the words that Paul used in his teaching them about brotherly love. Thus, it is of divine origin. A beautiful statement, really, of inspiration here. For ye yourselves were taught of God. How were they taught of God? Through Paul. God speaking through human agency. Not to take this to the aspect that Paul had inspiration. But when a preacher or teacher stands up and preaches the Word of God, isn't that being taught of God? The origin is still divine in nature, even though he himself is not inspired. He is using an inspired book to do that teaching, an inspired book that came from God. And thus it is of divine origin. That would certainly prompt us to be obedient to the Word, wouldn't it? Pay attention to it. And as the Bereans did, search the Scriptures whether it's so. Because the Scriptures find their origin in God. Now then he says it touching brotherly love. But then he comes down, you're taught of God to love one another. Different word from brotherly love. Brotherly love is actually one word made up of two parts. A word which is brother and then a word which is love. The part that's dealing with love there is the Greek word phileo. But here it is from the Greek verb love, agapao. We generally, in hearing it pronounced today, agape. But that's the noun form. Agapao is a verbal form, which would be here. The noun form was found several times in this book, 1 Thessalonians chapter 1, verse 3, chapter 3, verse 6. But notice chapter 3 and verse 12 in particular. The Lord make you to increase and abound in love one toward another and toward all, even as we do toward you. There's an increase and abound in love, and there the noun form agape. Here, we're taught of God to love one another, and we are to increase more in that love of one another. Again, repetition. Paul uses it quite a bit, as does Peter, as does any good teacher. What's the difference between the agapao love and the phileo love?
One's a noun and the other's a verb.
One's a noun and one's a verb. Some smart aleck. That's true. One's a noun and one's a verb. The phileo, actually, agapao and phileo would be both verbs. Philia would be the noun form of phileo. That deals with brotherly love, that love of kinship. It is, as some have expressed it, a natural affection that we have as for our family. When you come over to agape or agapao, it is more a decision-making process that, while involving the emotions, do not depend upon the emotions. When you're talking about brotherly love, you're talking about our emotions as, from our family. There's an emotional attachment there. That's the emotional aspect of it. When we come over to agape, the emotions take a back seat, because this is a decision that we make, a decision of the mind. Some have called it will love. It is a decision of the mind, a will, that we will do something.
Well, I've heard agape was supposed to be like unconditional love. That totally, like you said, emotional thing, isn't it? The difference between Jesus saying, Peter, you love me, I think he used agape. You're after that, you know, I can let go. That's what I call it.
And that goes back, an unconditional love. I always kind of cringe at that, because in some senses it is conditional, depending on your context in that situation. Agape is a decision, though, to do what's in their best interest.
Whether you like them or not.
Yeah, whether you like them or not.
That's what
We, we don't, I'll love you if you do this. It was a love for all men. But it's always doing what's best, what's in the best interest of individuals. And that, thus, is why Jesus could teach us, love your enemies. He doesn't use phileo in that. He uses agape. Why? Because it is a decision in the mind to do what's in the best interest of even your enemies. Let me extend it a little bit in relationship to the church. We go to, try to restore someone. They resist that restoration. They don't show an interest in being restored. And so eventually we must withdraw fellowship from them. Is that an act of agape love? Well, of course it is. Because that is the last step, if you will, in our attempt to try to save their souls. It's in their best interest. What is in their best interest is not always pleasant. How many of you, as parents, spanked your children? How many of you, in growing up, got spanked? Was that love? Well, of course it was. Didn't feel good on either part, really. Although when I heard the statement, "This is going to hurt me more than you," before getting a belt or something, I never believed it. When you become a parent, you start understanding a little bit more, but it's done out of love. And thus you whip the child because you love the child. That's in the best interest of that child. Sometimes a severe type of spanking. Why? Because it's in the best interest. So that's the type of love that agape is. It includes that, yes, rebuke, that chastisement. It includes all of that because you're doing what is in the best interest of that person. But that's a decision of the mind. I don't have to have, and go back to love your enemies that Jesus said. I don't have to have an affection for my enemy. I just don't. It would be contrary to our nature. But I still have to love him in the agape sense that I'm going to do what's in his best interest, even without having any affection for him whatsoever. I still practice that type of love. That's why I say affections, when you're dealing with agape or agapao, takes a back seat. Phileo, it takes the front seat, basically. It's basic, your centerfold part is right there at the emotions, a family relationship. You get to agape, and that's why in 1 Peter 1:22, Peter talks about you've been born, seeing you purified your souls and obeying the truth through the Spirit unto an unfeigned love of the brethren. That's sincere love, but it's that Greek word phileo. You come upon that obedience to the truth into that family relationship, and thus you have that family type of love one toward another. But then he says, see that you love one another. Why? The love there is agapao. So while it begins with that natural affection that you have as a family, in that family relationship, it grows and develops to a greater love and always doing what is best for them. Paul mentioned John 21, I think, is the chapter. And Jesus questioned Peter, do you love me? He uses the word agape. Peter's response, yes, Lord, you know that I phileo you. Jesus asked him the second time, do you agape me? Yes, Lord, I phileo you. Third time Jesus says, do you phileo me? Now then, there's been a lot of questions as to why did Jesus use phileo the third time instead of agape? I'm not sure we have a good answer for it, but that's something for you to study on your own. And Peter was grieved that the third time he said, do you phileo me? And he says, you know that I phileo you. Jesus' intent was, and if you remember the response, feed my sheep, tend my sheep, take care of them. Allow that love to grow and develop into that agape love. So there's a little lesson on that aspect of love that we see here. Touching brotherly love, you need not that I write unto you, but you're taught of God to love agape one another, or agapao one another. And in verse 10, he then adds, and indeed, you do it toward all the brethren which are in all Macedonia, but we beseech you, brethren, that ye increase more and more. So Paul did not need to write them and exhort them to do this because they were already doing it. To all of the brethren in Macedonia, by the way, if you go back to chapter 1 and verse 3, this is a demonstration of that when it says, remembering without ceasing your work of faith and labor of love, the patience of hope in our Lord Jesus Christ in the sight of God and our Father. So they were demonstrating this toward all the brethren in Macedonia. Now then, Paul desires them to abound in it, to do it more and more. We mentioned chapter 3 and verse 12, in which he basically encourages the same thing, that the Lord make you to increase and abound in love one toward another and toward all men, even as we do toward you. And in chapter 4 and verse 1, furthermore then, we beseech you, brethren, and exhort you by the Lord Jesus, that as ye received of us how ye ought to walk and to please God, so you would abound more and more. Notice that in this admonition, he also refers to them as brethren. That affectionate term that he uses for them on a repeated basis here. Brethren, increase in this more and more. There's the tendency to get complacent with things. And there would have been on their part. So Paul's admonition, exhortation, do this more and more. Because he knows if it does not increase, then what's it going to do? It's going to decrease. It's going to diminish. It will not remain static. It's either going to increase or it's going to decrease. I'm going to say the same. These would be Macedonia, such places as Philippi, Berea, other locations in Macedonia. But notice also the praise that Paul gives them for doing it. And again, we would mention the fact that we should give praise to those who are doing God's will. Encouragement to continue doing it. Richard Blight, in the exegetical summary of 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, answers the question, how could they show their love to all the brothers in Macedonia? And he answered this by saying, Thessalonica was the capital city of the province of Macedonia. The Thessalonians could show their love to Christian brethren from other places in Macedonia when those brothers came to the capital. They could have shown their love by providing hospitality. They could also provide help to churches in other towns. And he mentions pantos, all, means all the brethren that they came in contact with. So here's all of the brethren that they would come in contact with. You show brotherly love, you demonstrate brotherly love to them. And thus that brotherly love would extend, they would be doing it toward brethren that are in Macedonia and other places. And the brotherly love they would show them would then be extended as they showed brotherly love to others. It's something that should spread and not be held back or held to oneself. Any other questions or comments real quick before we end?
Well, a lot of times you see people, they do something good for somebody, and they tell them to go pass it on, or
Pass it on. Do it to others. And that is this phenomena that we're seeing, can I use that term, and what we're seeing around in different places of passing it forward. And where you go up and I'll pay for the next person's meal or whatever, and passing it forward, and they try and keep it going that way. Same type of principle. Okay, then next week we'll start with verse 11 and the 5 admonitions that are based upon this verse 10 that we just read.